rises on the eastern ridge, thick, fast, too wide for any single rider. 12 men crest the rise, rifles resting easy across their saddles. For behind them rolls a heavy wagon bound in iron, a cage bolted to its bed, chains coiled like something waiting. On the porch of a lonely ranch house stands a figure far larger than any man. Rifle steady against one shoulder, finger already on the trigger. Halt at the fence, a man in a grey duster smiles. Weighted ropes fly from both flanks around the legs. Around the arms, she hits the dirt hard. She tears one rope clean in half with bare hands. Sends a rider tumbling from his saddle, surges upright again, half free, reaching for the fallen rifle. 4 more ropes, thicker, tighter. The cage door swings open. Reins uncoil across the yard. A steam whistle splits the morning air. 4. There are no tracks for 100 miles in any direction. She lifts her head toward the sound. Arizona Territory, 1883. The fence post did not want to go into the ground. Bryn Larkin did not care what the fence post wanted. She drove it down with the flat of her palm. One strike, then another. The wood groaned. The earth gave up, and the post stood there, obedient, sunk 2 feet into hardpan that would have broken a normal man's shovel in an hour. Bryn was not a normal woman. She stood close to 10 feet tall. Her shoulders alone were wider than the doorway of most cabins in the territory. Her hands could close around a fence post the way other women closed a hand around a teacup, and when she walked, the ground seemed to remember it. A low tremor, a settling of dust. For, like the land itself was taking notes, she had been born this way. Nobody in Redstone Flats could explain it. Her mother had been tall, her father had been broad. But neither of them had prepared the valley for what came out of that bedroom on a February night 21 years ago. For the midwife fainted. That was the story, anyway. Bryn had heard it told 100 different ways by 100 different mouths, and she had stopped correcting any of them, because what was there to correct? She was big. She had always been big. And the world had always found a way to make that feel like something she owed an apology for. Her whole life ran on a rhythm most folks never had to think about. She rose before the sun because the day's chores took her longer to plan than to do every door in this territory built 2 feet too short, every chair built 2 sizes too small. Every saddle she'd ever tried on before her father had one custom forge just simply wrong for a body like hers. She had learned early to move through a world that had not been built with her in mind. She had learned to duck, to fold, to apologize with her shoulders before she ever opened her mouth. She had also learned, just as early, that none of that folding made the world any kinder to her. It only made her smaller in places that had nothing to do with her size. She wiped her forehead with the back of one enormous wrist and looked down the fence line. 1/2 mile of new post and wire, strung in 4 days' seas alone. No hired hands, no brothers, no father anymore to stand at the far end and holler encouragement across the flats. Just her and the wind. And the cattle watching her with the mild suspicion cattle reserve for anything larger than themselves. She had built this fence because the old one had rotted through the winter, because the banknote said the herd had to be accounted for by spring. Because a woman with no family left to lean on did not get the luxury of a fence falling down twice, which was fine. She told herself that a lot lately. It was fine, until she thought about the fact that it wasn't. She picked up the mallet again. Somewhere behind her, 1/2 mile off, the roofline of the Larkin Ranch house sagged against the sky like an old man's shoulders. The paint had peeled 2 summers back. The porch boards creaked under weight they were never built to hold, except she'd reinforced those herself months ago with beams cut from the same stubborn oak that refused to die on the ridge above the creek. She loved that house. She hated what it had become. For both of those things were true at the same time, and she had learned to carry them together the way she carried everything else, without complaint and without much choice. Her father used to say a person's strength wasn't the thing they could lift, or it was the thing they could carry without setting it down in front of people. Sheriff Wade Larkin had said a lot of things like that. Quiet things, or delivered while cleaning a rifle or mending a saddle, for never looking up. Or like the wisdom cost him something to say out loud, and he'd rather not make a show of the paying. He'd been dead a year. Her mother, Ruth, longer than that. Fever, the doctor had called it. Fever, and a debt that never stopped climbing, even after the fever broke her for good. Bryn set the mallet down. She looked at her hands, rough, scarred across the knuckles, bigger than any hand had a right to be, and yet somehow never big enough to hold on to the people she loved most. She remembered times standing at her mother's bedside during that last bad winter, one of her hands wrapped so carefully around Ruth's small fingers that she'd been terrified genuinely, for a bone deep, terrified of breaking something so fragile just by holding on. She had already stood taller than the doorframe for years by then, already stronger than any 3 men in the county combined, and utterly powerless to keep a fever from doing what fevers did. That was the lesson nobody warned her about. That strength like hers had a ceiling. That the things worth saving most were sometimes exactly the things her hands were too big, too clumsy, too much, brave at all. For every Sunday, weather allowing, she made the climb up the rise above the creek to the 2 wooden markers, planted beneath the crooked oak. For she talked to them the way other folks talk to God, except she'd always privately suspected her parents were better listeners than most preachers she'd sat through, and a good deal less interested in collecting from her for the privilege. She remembered her mother's hands most of all quick, clever things, always moving piecing quilts by lamplight, long after the rest of the house had gone dark, her needle flashing silver through cloth with a precision that had never once translated to her daughter's enormous fingers, for no matter how many winters Ruth Larkin had spent patiently trying to teach her. For you don't have to be delicate to be careful, her mother used to say, for guiding Bryn's hand around a needle size for a child's fingers, watching her daughter's grip swallow it whole. Careful's a decision, not a size. Bryn had never gotten the hang of quilting. She'd broken exactly 4 needles trying, and ruined enough fabric to make her mother laugh instead of scold, which had somehow felt like the greater victory of the 2. But she'd kept the lesson underneath it long after she'd given up the needle itself. Careful's a decision, not a size. She'd built this whole ranch on that sentence, 1 fence post and 1 gentle hand at a time. Her father had taught differently. Patience, more repetition, draw the rifle, right the target, breathe out slow before you squeeze. Do it again. Do it again until your hands stop asking permission from your head. It stood behind her in the yard 100 evenings, adjusting her enormous shoulders by fractions of an inch, never once treating the work as strange, just because the student standing in front of him could have snapped the rifle in half without trying. You've got a gift most folks would kill for, he'd told her once, and then killed most folks for wanting to kill you for having it. It meant, in Wade Larkin's roundabout way of putting things, her size was a fact of the world, same as weather, same as drought, same as good years and bad ones, something to be managed wisely, never something to apologize for. She'd believed him, mostly, on the good days. On the days like today, with the mallet heavy and honest in her hand, and the fence line stretching clean behind her, she believed him completely. She'd been up to the graves, just 2 mornings past, told her mother the fence was nearly finished. Told her father the herd looked thin but healthy, the way he'd always preferred it, lean muscle, not fat, cattle built for work instead of show, same as everything else worth keeping on this land. She hadn't told either of them about the note, about Voss, about the calendar closing in around her like a slow, patient fist. Because there was a particular kind of cowardice, she'd decided somewhere along the walk back down that morning, in only ever visiting the dead to share good news, as if grief itself needed protecting from the truth. Her parents, of all people, had ever once flinched away from a hard fact in their lives. She would tell them Sunday. She always did, eventually. Just not yet. Not until she had something better to offer than the shape of her own fear. She heard the horses before she saw them. Not 1 horse, several, coming up the road from town in no hurry at all, which was worse than if they'd come at a gallop. A gallop meant urgency, something else. This was a man who wanted her to watch him take his time. She turned. 3 riders, dust rising behind them like a slow curtain, closing on a place she hadn't agreed to be in. The man in front rode a black stallion groomed to a shine that had no business existing on a cattle ranch. Wore a grey suit, tailored, wrong for the heat, wrong for the dirt, wrong for everything about this land except his own vanity. Harrison Voss did not dress for Arizona. Gesine Voss dressed for a version of Arizona that bent to him. Behind him rode two men. One was young, nervous, his eyes darting everywhere except toward Bryn directly. The other was older, scarred along the jaw in a thin white line that never tanned no matter how long he spent under the sun. Reeve Malone. Bryn's father had put that scar there, or near enough chased him through a fence outside Dodge City years back. Horse thief caught red-handed, tripped on his own boot heel, and split his chin open on a water trough. Malone had never forgiven the scar. He had definitely never forgiven the man who'd put it there. Ross reined in at the edge of the yard, and even from his saddle he had to tilt his head back to look Bryn in the eye. She watched something flicker across his face when he did it. Not fear exactly. Voss didn't believe in fear, or at least he didn't believe it applied to him. But there was a flicker. A small, involuntary thing. The kind of look men gave mountains right before they decided to build a railroad through them anyway. Miss Larkin, Voss said. His voice was smooth. Practiced. The voice of a man who had learned long ago that most people could be managed with a calm tone and a cruel intention, so long as the two never showed up in the same sentence. Voss, fine work on that fence. He nodded toward the line she'd just finished. Shame it won't matter much longer. Bryn didn't answer that. She'd learned that silence made men like Voss uncomfortable. They needed a reaction to work with. Take that away. And they had to keep talking. And the more they talked, the more they gave up. You know why I'm here, Voss said. I know why you think you're here. Malone snorted behind him. Voss did not. Voss said. $650. Purchased fair and legal from the Redstone Trust Bank 3 weeks past. Due Friday. That's 4 days, Miss Larkin. 4. I'm aware of the calendar. Are you aware of what happens if the sum isn't met? Bryn folded her arms. 4. The motion alone creaked the leather of her work gloves. You'll tell me anyway. Something almost like amusement crossed Voss's face. Almost. The sheriff removes you, and I burn this house to the foundation stone, as a house this far gone isn't worth the cost of tearing it down board by board. Fire's cheaper. Fire's faster. My mother is buried on that hill. Bryn's voice did not rise. It did not need to, for it came from somewhere low and old, somewhere that had been carrying this particular weight for longer than 4 days. My father, beside her. I am not leaving them so you can burn what's left of what they built. Sentiment, Voss said, does not clear a debt. Neither does cruelty, yet here you are, riding it out like it's a virtue. The nervous rider beside Malone finally found his voice, though it came out thinner than he probably intended. Mr. Voss, maybe we ought to— Quiet, Voss. Voss didn't even look at him. Nobody asked for your opinion on this. The young rider went red and silent, eyes dropping to his saddle horn. Your man there has better instincts than you do, Bryn, and might want to start listening to him instead of parading him around for scenery. My men do what I tell them, Miss Larkin. Rather the point of employing them. Must be lonely. Surrounding yourself with people too scared to tell you the truth. I find the truth considerably overrated as company. Voss's smile thinned further, something colder sliding in behind it. Loyalty, on the other hand, I find endlessly useful. Perhaps you might consider capitulating some before Friday. Loyal to what, exactly? Your version of the law? The one you bought, same as you bought this note? Loyal to survival, Miss Larkin. 4. It's the only religion this territory actually rewards. He gathered his reins, the stallion shifting restlessly beneath him. You'd do well to convert before it's too late to matter. 4. My father used to say men who talk about survival as a religion are usually the ones who've already sacrificed everyone around them to it. Something flickered again. Behind Voss's eyes, a hairline crack, quick and involuntary. Your father is dead, Miss Larkin. Firmans from dead sheriffs don't carry much weight against live paper. Funny. 4. Feels like his way's plenty, considering it's still standing between you and everything you want. Voss's jaw worked, the muscle along it jumping once, sharp and visible even from the ground. For a moment, Bryn thought he might say something true, something that would have told her exactly how deep the desperation ran beneath that grey suit. 4. Instead he swallowed it, folded it back beneath the smooth, practiced mask, and gathered himself into the version of calm he clearly preferred people to remember him by. Something tightened across Voss's face that wasn't quite anger. Bryn watched it closely, the way her father had taught her, a small crack, a hairline flaw showing up in an otherwise smooth piece of iron. For half a heartbeat, something else lived behind his eyes. Something that looked, if she squinted at it right, almost like panic. Then it was gone, folded back beneath the practiced calm. You mistake urgency for virtue, Voss said. I have no need to justify myself to you. You keep telling yourself that. Make it truer with repeating. Malone shifted in his saddle. Voss would not stop looking at her hands. Voss's jaw tightened, just slightly. Rough that Bryn saw it and filed it away, the way her father had taught her to file away every small crack in a man's composure. He's afraid of something, she thought. Not me, not exactly me, something else. 4 days, Voss said again. Fran. And this time his voice had lost some of its earlier polish. Fran thinner, tighter, a man reciting a line he needed to believe more than he needed her to. Friday noon. I'd advise you not to test how patient I can be. He turned the stallion. The 2 riders followed. Bryn watched them go, watched the dust rise and settle, watched the empty road stretch back out toward Redstone Flats like nothing at all had just happened. Nothing had happened. Not really. Just a man promising to burn her home to the ground because he had bought the paper that let him. She stood in the yard a long time after they'd gone, because there was a version of this moment where she cried. She knew that version existed. She had visited it plenty of times over the last year, alone, for at night, when the cabin was too quiet and the bed too big, and every creak of the settling wood sounded like her father's boots on the porch. Except it never was. She did not visit that version today. Instead she walked inside. Floorboards took her weight, the way they always did, a low groan, a familiar surrender. She crossed to the stone hearth, where a silver star sat on the mantel next to a revolver, twice the size of any a normal man might carry, forged special 3 years back, by a blacksmith in Prescott, who'd taken one look at Wade Larkin's daughter and understood exactly what kind of iron the world was going to require of her. She touched the star, cold under her fingers, small in her enormous palm, though it had never once felt small to her. She remembered the day her father had first pinned it to her collar, just to see how it looked, laughing when it barely covered a knuckle's width of her shirt. You'll grow into plenty of things, he'd said. That badge won't be one of them, but the meaning behind it will fit you fine. She had already stood taller than him by an inch for years. He had never once flinched at that, never once made her feel like the growing itself was the problem. 4 days, she said out loud, to no one, to the empty room, to her father maybe, wherever he was listening from. She did not know how she would find $650 in 4 days. She knew with the same certainty she knew her own name that she was not leaving. The next morning she rode out before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. Because the herd needed checking and grief did not pay debts, and there was exactly nothing to be gained by sitting in a quiet house, feeling sorry for herself. Duke carried her the way he always did, steady, for unbothered, draft horse built from Percheron stock, crossed twice over just to hold her weight. Bred special the same year, the blacksmith forged her father's second revolver. Because a horse that size didn't exist naturally, and Wade Larkin had refused to let his daughter walk everywhere like some kind of apology. She rode the fence line first. Then out past the north pasture, where a handful of her cattle had wandered near the dry wash that fed into Coldwater Canyon. The morning was already hot, the kind of hot that made the horizon shimmer and lie to you about distances. Which was why at first she thought the shape near the rocks was just heat playing tricks, except it didn't move like heat. Heat didn't have arms. Heat didn't have a shape that folded in on itself the way a body folds when it's given up. Duke slowed on his own, ears forward, a low, uneasy sound in his throat. I see it, Bryn murmured. Easy. She approached carefully. For out here, a body on the ground could be a trap, could be bait, could be any number of things designed to look helpless and turn out to be neither. Kept one hand near the long rifle strapped along Duke's saddle, scaled up the same as everything else that belonged to her. Except the closer she came, the less it looked like anything but exactly what it was. An old man, alone, dying by inches under a sun that did not care one bit whether he had a family somewhere worrying over him, and there it was again, that small, ugly clock ticking in the back of her mind. 4 days. 3.5, if she was being honest about the hour. Every minute spent here was a minute not spent finding $650 from thin air. She almost heard her own voice arguing with itself. You don't have time for this, Bryn. Except you don't have time not to. Except what kind of person rides past a dying man to go save a house made of wood and nails? Except the house has her mother buried on the hill beside it. 4. Except none of that matters if she becomes the kind of woman who steps over a stranger to protect it. She was already moving before the argument finished. It was an elderly man, dressed in a heavy coat, far too warm for this country, baked in dust, white hair matted with sweat and dirt, face burned an angry red by a sun that did not care how important a person was before it started peeling the skin off them. No horse in sight, an empty canteen a few feet away, tipped on its side like it had given up trying to help. Bryn swung down off Duke a considerable drop, ground, meeting her boots with a soft thud that most men would have called a landing, and she simply called walking and knelt beside him. Knelt was a generous word. Even kneeling, she was taller than most men standing. Mister, she touched his shoulder. Her hand alone covered most of it. Mister, can you hear me? A groan, cracked lips, parting water, he rasped. Barely a sound at all, sandpaper dragged over dry wood. Slow, she said, already unhooking her own canteen. Or you'll bring it right back up. She lifted his head. One palm was enough to cradle the whole of it, and tipped a careful trickle between his lips. He coughed, swallowed. His hand came up, trembling, trying to grab for more. She pulled the canteen back gently. At a time, mister. You've been out here a while. His eyes opened, pale blue, sharp despite everything, and they went wide the moment they focused on her. For not fear. She was used to fear. She braced it for it every time a stranger looked at her properly for the first time. This wasn't that. This was something closer to wonder. Well, the old man rasped, and even half dead in the dirt, for there was a dry thread of humour buried in it. For I always did wonder if the stories about this territory were exaggerated. Bryn almost laughed. Almost. She didn't have the energy to spare on almost. You're not dead yet, she said. Save the jokes for after. After, he repeated. Generous of you to assume there's an after. There will be. If you stop talking and let me get you out of the sun. He tried to sit up on his own. Failed. His legs simply weren't answering him anymore. Bryn didn't wait for him to try a second time. She's an arm under him. And for her, lifting a grown man off the ground required about as much effort as lifting a sack of feed. 4, which was to say some, 4, but not much, and none of it visible on her face. Breath caught. Good Lord. Not quite, Bryn said. Just tall. She got him up onto Duke, which took some careful manoeuvring, given the animal's own considerable size, and once he was slumped forward against the horse's neck, she took the reins in one hand and started walking. 2 hours back to the ranch, at least. She could have ridden. Duke could have carried them both without much complaint. 4, but something in her didn't like the idea of climbing up behind a half-conscious old man and trusting he wouldn't slide right off during the ride, so she walked. The desert sun found new ways to punish her for it with every mile. Heat came up off the packed earth in visible waves, and sweat cut trails down her back. She didn't have a free hand to wipe away. She didn't complain. Complaining had never once fixed anything, in her experience. 4. Neither had waiting for someone else to fix it for her. By the time they reached the ranch house, the sun was low and orange, and the shadows had gone long and purple across the yard. Bryn half carried, half guided the old man inside, and laid him down on her own bed, the only one in the house built to her size, which meant it swallowed him whole, a small, dust-caked shape in the middle of all that space. She fetched water, clean rag. 4. She worked through the evening the way she worked through everything steady, unhurried, methodical. Around panic never once boiled a pot of broth any faster. Around midnight his fever broke, his breathing settled into something even, something real. Bryn sat in the chair beside the bed, her own chair, built oversized like everything else in this house, and even so it groaned under her when she leaned back, cleaning her father's revolver in the low gold light of a kerosene lamp. The rhythm of the cloth against the barrel steadied her the way it always had. You saved my life, the old man said quietly. She hadn't realized his eyes were open. You'd have done the same, she said. I imagine. Don't be so sure. His voice was stronger now. Stayed here. For the world's full of people who'd have ridden right past a dying man, especially one who looked like he had nothing worth taking from. Bryn set the revolver down. Well, I'm not most people. No. He looked at her properly, then really looked, the way almost no one bothered to. Parsies, at her. I don't imagine you are. Name's Bryn Larkin, Josiah Renwick. He tried to sit up on the pillows. Managed it barely before, then his eyes drifted, slow and disbelieving, across the room, the ceiling built 1.5 feet higher than any ordinary cabin, the door frame wide enough to drive a wagon through, the chair she sat in easily large enough to seat 3 grown men comfortably. Forgive an old fool's curiosity. Did you build all this yourself? My father did. Mostly. She almost smiled. Almost. I've had to fix a fair share of it since. It's remarkable. It's practical, Bryn corrected. Remarkable's just what strangers call practical when they're too polite to call it strange. Josiah's mouth twitched. I stand corrected. You should. You're lying in the one piece of furniture in this house that actually fits somebody. I noticed. I feel rather like a mouse who's wandered into a church, a mouse who nearly died of thirst 2 hours from my fence line. An accurate mouse, Bren. Something in Bryn's chest loosened, just slightly, at the unbothered rhythm of it. Strangers either stared at her in silence or overcompensated with too much chatter, too many questions about her size, delivered with a nervous, apologetic laugh. Josiah did neither, for he simply talked to her the way he might talk to anyone. It was, own small way, strangest thing a stranger had done in her presence in a long while. I owe you a debt, Larkin. You don't owe me anything. The words came out sharper than she meant. She softened them. Where I come from, you don't put a price on a human life. My father used to say that. Smart man. He was the sheriff here. Wade? Larkin. She said it, the way she always said it, half pride, half ache, the two feelings so tangled together by now she couldn't have separated them if she tried. Past a year back, Josiah was quiet a moment, for, watching her with those sharp pale eyes, the kind of eyes that had clearly spent a whole life sizing up rooms and men and situations before anyone else in them had finished blinking. And your mother? Before that, feverish Bryn shrugged, though the motion carried none of the casualness she was reaching for. It's just me now, alone. Out here. He glanced toward the window, toward the dark shape of the yard beyond it. That roof sags. Fence near the road's been mended more times than it's held. Struggling, something flared in Bryn's chest, quick and hot. Pride, mostly, a little bit of something else. I manage fine, Mr. Renwick. I meant no offence. Didn't say you did. You said it with your face, though. Bryn opened her mouth, closed it. Because he wasn't wrong, exactly, and there was something strangely disarming about being caught out by a man who 12 hours ago had been unconscious in the dirt. You're observant for a fella who nearly died today, she muttered. I've been told it's an unfortunate habit. Told by who? Business partners, mostly. Barforthe's inviting me to dinner. A dry, tired smile. Turns out most men don't care to be observed quite as closely as I observe. I wouldn't know. I don't get invited to many dinners either. For their loss, Prairie said simply, and there was nothing performed about it. Throw flattery dressed up as kindness. For a plain flat fact, the way he seemed to deliver most things. Silence stretched, not uncomfortable, just full. You owe someone money, Josiah said finally. Not a question. Bryn's jaw tightened. $650. Man bought the note off the bank 3 weeks back. Name of Garrison Voss. Something moved across Josiah's face at the name. Small, fast. Gone before Bryn could be sure she'd seen it at all. Voss, he repeated. You know him? I know of men like him. Josiah leaned back against the pillow, and for a moment he looked every one of his years, tired down to the bone. Men who buy debts the way other men buy horses. It's never about the money owed, Miss Larkin. It's about what the debt lets them take. He wants my land. I expect he does. Josiah's eyes drifted shut. Land has a way of being wanted out here. Especially land that sits in the wrong place at the wrong time. Bryn wanted to ask him what he meant by that. She didn't get the chance. His breathing had already gone slow, and even before the exhaustion finally catching up to whatever strange, sharp mind lived behind those pale eyes. She sat with him a while longer, cleaned the rest of the rifle, watched the moon climb the window glass. He woke once more before dawn, sudden and thrashing, a low sound catching in his throat that wasn't quite a word. Bryn was out of the chair before she'd fully decided to move, one broad hand settling light against his shoulder, an anchor instead of a restraint. "Easy," she said. "You're safe. You're in my house. Nobody's coming for you here." Josiah's eyes opened wide and unseeing for a moment, chest heaving, the particular panic of a man who'd fallen asleep in one world and woken believing himself still trapped in another. "The desert," he rasped. "I was still—" "You're not." Bryn kept her voice low, steady, the way she might have gentled a spooked horse. "You're in a bed built too big for you, in a house that creaks worse than an old ship, or with a woman twice your size sitting guard, so nothing else gets the chance to finish what the sun started. That's the whole of it." Something in his shoulders loosened. A dry, unsteady laugh escaped him, more relief than humour. "When you put it that way, it sounds almost hospitable. It is hospitable. You're just used to a different kind. I'm used to marble floors and men who lie to my face for money." Josiah pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. "This is considerably more honest. Honest doesn't come with good coffee, though." "Fair warning, I gathered that much already from the first cup. You drank half of it, out of politeness. You drank half of it because you were parched half to death, Mr. Renwick. Don't dress it up as manners." Something that might have been a real smile tugged at the corner of his cracked lips. "You're a difficult woman to lie to. I've had practice. Most folks lie to me about the same three things: my size, my strength, and whether they're actually as comfortable around me as they're pretending to be." Josiah studied her for a long moment in the low lamplight, his sharp pale eyes unclouded now despite the hour. "I imagine that gets tiring." "It does." She hadn't meant to say it so plainly. The words surprised her a little, coming out of her own mouth. "Most days I don't let myself notice how tiring. Easier that way. And tonight I can't. I'm apparently confessing things to a man I met 12 hours ago while he lies in my bed recovering from nearly dying." She shook her head, something almost like a laugh escaping her despite everything. "I'll blame the hour. Blame whatever you like. I won't repeat it to anyone. You say that like you've got anyone left to repeat it to." "Fair point." His eyes drifted, heavy again, towards sleep. "Though I suspect, Miss Larkin, that you and I are going to prove each other wrong about a great many fair points before this is finished." She didn't know what to make of that. She sat with it a long while after his breathing evened out again, turning the strange warm weight of it over in her mind the way she might turn over a coin, found somewhere she hadn't expected to find one. Then she blew out the lamp, wrapped herself in a thin shawl, slept sitting up in the chair, one hand resting near her father's revolver, the way she always did when the world felt a little too uncertain to trust with her back turned. When she woke, the light through the window was pale and grey, kind that came just before real dawn. Her neck ached from the angle she'd slept in. She stretched, rolled her shoulders and looked toward the bed. Empty. For one sharp cold second she thought no. She didn't let herself finish the thought. The blankets were folded, neat, deliberate, not the mess of a man who'd stumbled out half-conscious in the dark. She stood, crossed the room. On the small table beside the bed sat two things: a pocket watch, gold, worn smooth at the edges from years of handling, and engraved along the inside of the case in careful script words too small for most eyes, but not for hers, and a folded piece of paper. She opened the note first. "Larkin, thank you for seeing me as a man and not as a burden left in the dirt. You gave me kindness when you had every reason to keep walking. I found a ride into town before dawn. I did not wish to wake you. You've earned the rest. Hold to your father's lessons. Some storms you stand through. Others pass on their own if you give them the chance. I do not forget a debt, Miss Larkin, and I have never once forgotten a kindness. J. Renwick." She read it twice. Then she picked up the watch, turned it over in her enormous palm, and found the engraving along the inner case. To measure what matters, not what's owed. She didn't know what to make of that. She tucked it into her apron pocket anyway, next to her father's silver star, and told herself it was just a token, a strange sentimental token from a strange old man she'd likely never see again. Because that was easier than sitting with a small, stubborn hope that had crept in sometime during the night and refused to leave. Except hope didn't pay $650 either. She had 2 days left, washed her face in the basin, saddled Duke, and rode for Redstone Flats to see what the bank might be talked into. The town sat low in a dry valley, ringed by red cliffs that turned the colour of old rust in the early light. For wooden buildings crowded shoulder to shoulder along the main street, and every one of them seemed to shrink a little as Bryn rode past. Horses, tied at the hitching posts, pulled at their reins. When Duke's hoofs struck the packed dirt a sound like slow thunder that most animals in this territory had learned to fear on instinct long before they'd ever laid eyes on the woman riding him. She tied up outside Pruitt's mercantile. The boardwalk groaned under her boots. She'd long since stopped noticing the way conversations paused when she walked into a room. Stopped, mostly. Some days it still landed somewhere tender. Iris Pruitt looked up from behind the counter and offered her the kind of smile that came from genuine warmth rather than performance. That was rare enough in this town that Bryn had learned to treasure it. "Morning, Bryn." He set down the ledger he'd been squinting at. "Heard Voss rode out your way yesterday. Word travels. Word always travels faster than a woman on a giant's horse, and that's saying something. He tried for lightness. It didn't quite land, not with the worry sitting so plainly behind his eyes. You holding up? For I'm standing here, aren't I? That's not the same thing. And you know it." Cyrus lowered his voice, though there was no one else in the store to hear. "Voss bought up the livery last month. Rook the smithy the month before that. Man's buying this whole valley, one desperate soul at a time, and everybody's too scared to tell him no. You're not the first person he's tried this on," Cyrus added, quieter now. "Family lost their spread outside town last spring. Tramway bought note. Sudden default. Sheriff's men at the door before anybody could blink twice. For Ellis Hendricks packed up what he could carry and headed for California with nothing left to show for 15 years of work. I didn't know that. Not many do. Ross makes sure of it. Quiet ruin doesn't scare off new investors the way loud ruin does." Cyrus's jaw tightened, and anger in him Bryn rarely saw surface. The Delacroix widow, out past the North Fork, same story, near enough. Different excuse, same ending. Bryn absorbed that in silence a moment, feeling the shape of it settle heavy alongside everything else. How many? All told, 4 families that I know of for certain. Probably more I don't. Cyrus shook his head slowly. "First one who stood on your porch and told him no to his face, far as I've heard. Most folks just quietly disappear once the paper comes due. Then maybe it's past time somebody didn't disappear quietly." "I'm telling him no. I know you are." Fran, something like pride flickered across the old shopkeeper's face. "Your father would be telling him the same thing if he were still around to say it. He'd probably say it a lot louder than I do. He'd probably be standing on this counter doing it." Prairie said, and for a moment something like real laughter passed between them, small and brief and welcome. Throat tightened anyway, right on the heels of it. She nodded instead of trying to speak past it, and set 2 coins on the counter for a small sack of flour. She was halfway back to the door when Cyrus called after her. His voice dropped low again. "Bryn. Fella been through town the last 2 days. Asking questions." She turned. "What kind of questions about you?" Cyrus's mouth tightened into a thin line, wanting to know your size, exact as he could get it. 4. Whether you had family, whether anybody'd come looking if you left the territory sudden. Something cold moved through Bryn's chest, slow and unfamiliar. She'd been stared at her whole life, whispered about, procked, sometimes, by men who thought size was an invitation for cruelty rather than a reason for caution. This was different. This was a man collecting information the way a buyer collects information before making an offer. "Who is he?" "Calls himself Elmore Barker." Prairie shook his head slowly. "Travelling man. Talks smooth. Wears a coat too fine for this heat, same as Voss does, if that tells you anything. Said he represents an exhibition. A travelling one. Back east." Bryn's hand had gone still on the door frame. An exhibition of what? Cyrus didn't answer right away. And that silence told her more than any answer could have. "He's been showing folks a poster," Prairie said finally, gently. Like a man breaking bad news to someone he cared about. "For advertising for their next stop. I didn't want to believe it was about you. Then I saw the sketch on it." Bryn walked back to the counter. Slow. Deliberate. "Show me." Iris hesitated only a moment before reaching beneath the counter and producing a folded broadsheet, the kind normally used to advertise travelling circuses and medicine shows. He smoothed it flat. Wonders of the World exhibition, coming soon, a new marvel for our stage. Below the words sat a crude but unmistakable sketch for a woman's silhouette, drawn far larger than any human silhouette had a right to be, standing beside a tiny drawn figure of an ordinary man for scale, hat barely reaching her knee. Bryn stared at it for a long time, because there was a version of her that wanted to laugh. It was almost funny, for in the ugliest way that somewhere out there, for a man had looked at her life, her grief, father's badge, and her mother's grave, and the fence she'd built alone with her own 2 hands, and seen nothing but an attraction, a curiosity, a thing to put behind rope and charge folks a nickel to gawk at. And there was another version of her, quieter, colder, older than her 21 years, that understood exactly what this meant. She was 19, the first time a stranger had offered her father money for her. A travelling peddler, passing through Redstone Flats with a wagon full of tonics and trinkets, had caught sight of her hauling water from the well already taller than any man in the territory, already strong enough to carry 4 full buckets at once without strain, and had approached her father with an offer delivered in the same easy transactional tone a man might use to buy a promising colt. $50, the peddler had said. Maybe more, once word got around. There's good money in Wonders, Sheriff. Better than ranching, I'd wager, and a sight easier on the back. She remembered her father's face going very still, remembered the particular quiet before he'd answered, quiet she'd come over the years to recognize as the exact shape of a man deciding whether a situation called for words or something sharper. He'd chosen words that day. Off my land, Reed said, low even before the man's own horse had even come to a full stop. And if I ever hear you've made that same offer to anyone else in this territory, wonder or not, I'll make sure the only wagon you're riding out of Arizona in has bars on it. The peddler had left in a hurry. Bryn had stood by the well the whole time, water forgotten, watching her father's shoulders stay tight and furious, long after the wagon had disappeared over the ridge. She'd asked him that evening why the man had wanted to buy her, of all things, like she was livestock instead of a person. Father hadn't needed to kneel to meet her eyes. By then she'd already stood a full head taller than him for years, but he'd taken her face, in both his weathered hands all the same, the way he had since she was small. Folks look at anything unusual and see a coin instead of a person, he'd told her. That's not a flaw in you, Bryn. That's a flaw in them. Don't you ever let a man like that convince you the flaw belongs to you instead. She'd believed him. Mostly. On the good days. Standing now in the doorway of Pruitt's Mercantile 2 years later, staring at a crude sketch of her own silhouette drawn beside a stranger for scale, she found herself wishing, fiercely and uselessly, that her father was still alive to walk out onto that street and say the same words to Elmore Barker that he'd once said to a peddler with a wagon full of tonics. Except he wasn't. And this time there was no one left standing between her and the coin except herself. Thought, too, of all the smaller moments, since the sideways glances from strangers passing through on the stage line, the careful overly polite distance most new arrivals kept until they'd decided for themselves whether she was dangerous or simply large, the way certain travelling salesmen still occasionally sized her up with a particular calculation of men who saw opportunity in anything the rest of the world found strange. He had learned to live alongside all of it, had built, brick by brick, a version of peace that didn't depend on other people's comfort with her existence. But peace built that carefully was also, she was coming to understand, fragile kind of thing sturdy enough to survive quiet years. And entirely unprepared for a man wealthy enough, France, and desperate enough to turn an old ugly impulse into an actual, itemized business arrangement. $50 once, a travelling wagon full of tonics, and a peddler too foolish to read her father's face before making his offer. Now it was an entire exhibition, backed by iron chains forged special and a cattle baron's collapsing fortune, and there was no sheriff left standing on this porch to send it running. Just her. Voss didn't just want her land anymore. Voss wanted her gone. 4. And if he couldn't scare her off it, if he couldn't bury her under a debt she couldn't pay, then apparently he was willing to sell her outright to the first travelling showman who came sniffing around with money and a poster and a hunger for something new to put on a stage. Grin. Cyrus's voice had gone careful, watching her face. You all right? She folded the broadsheet slowly, set it back on the counter, her hand not quite as steady as she wanted it to be. When's the last time you saw this Barker? Yesterday evening, down by the saloon. Talking with two of Voss's men, thick as thieves, Bryn's jaw set. 4. Somewhere behind the mercantile's front window, out on the dusty street, she caught sight of movement, a man in a coat too fine for the heat, standing across from the bank, watching the street with the patient, unhurried attention of someone who had already decided he had nothing to lose by waiting. He wasn't looking at the bank, he was looking at her. 4. And when their eyes met across that distance, Elmore Barker did not flinch, and he did not look away. 3. Simply tilted his head, for the way a man might size up a prize bull before an auction. 4. And offered her the faintest, coldest smile Bryn had ever seen on a human face. She had 2 days left to save her home. She understood now, standing in the doorway of Pruitt's mercantile, with a stranger's cold eyes fixed on her from across the street, that saving her home might no longer be the only thing she needed to survive. Triumph of Redstone Flats Part 2. Elmore Barker did not move from across the street. He just stood there, coat too fine for the heat, hands folded behind his back like a man admiring livestock at a county fair. Poor Bryn made herself walk toward the bank instead of toward him, because that was the smarter choice, because putting her hands on a stranger in the middle of Main Street, however badly she wanted to, would only hand Voss exactly the kind of story he needed. Wild giant assaults respectable visitor. That was a headline that wrote itself, and headlines like that had a way of turning into warrants. So she walked, boots loud on the boardwalk, her shadow swallowing 3 storefronts at once. 4. Which didn't stop her stomach from turning over every few feet. 4. But because somewhere behind her she could feel Barker's eyes still tracking her, patient, unbothered, the way a buyer studies a horse he's already decided to purchase and is only waiting on the paperwork. Redstone Trust Bank sat at the end of the street, the only brick building in town, solid and cold and entirely unbothered by the desperation that walked through its door every single week. Otis Fenwick stood up so fast when she came in that his chair nearly went over behind him. Miss Larkin. His collar looked too tight. It always looked too tight. Please sit. There wasn't a chair in the building that fit her properly. There never had been. She'd learned to half-perch on the edge of the ones offered, knees folded up near her chest, because refusing the gesture always seemed to wound men like Fenwick more than the chair itself ever could. I'll stand, she said. Won't take long. Fenwick's throat worked. For I expect you're here about the note. I'm here to ask for a month. Herd's healthy. I've got buyers lined up for the fall drive. 1 month, Mr. Fenwick. That's all I'm asking, Miss Larkin. The charter allows for an agricultural extension. You know that better than I do. I know the charter. Fenwick's hands had started that small nervous motion they always did, straightening papers that didn't need straightening. I also know the bank no longer holds your note. The deed's still registered through this office. You're still the intermediary. For that means you still have the authority. Authority, Fenwick laughed, and there was no humour anywhere in the sound. Authority means very little, Miss Larkin, when one man holds the debt on the bank itself. Bryn went still. What are you saying? Fenwick glanced toward the door, toward the window. 4. Toward anywhere that wasn't her face, because apparently what he was about to say cost him something to look at her while he said it. So I'm saying Garrison Voss is not the man this town believes him to be. His voice dropped low. Or he's not rich, Miss Larkin. Not any more. He's drowning. He owns half this valley. He owns paper on half this valley. There's a difference, and the difference is the only reason you're standing in my office right now instead of already packed and gone. Fenwick sat back down, heavily like the confessions had cost him physically. 2 years back Voss put nearly everything he had into a rail syndicate out of Santa Fe, the Sonoran line. Promised investors it would cut straight through this territory and turn every acre he touched into gold, and it didn't. It collapsed. Surveys came back wrong. Financing dried up. Half his partners pulled out within the month, and the ones who didn't are the same men now threatening to ruin him publicly if he doesn't produce a return. Fenwick's eyes finally lifted to hers. He needs a win, Miss Larkin. Fast one. Your land sits on the only clean grade through Coldwater Canyon. If he controls it, he can still salvage something from the wreckage. Sell the route, save face, save himself. So it was never about the $650. It was never about the money at all. Fenwick's voice cracked slightly. About survival. His and desperate men. Miss Larkin desperate men don't play by rules. They don't wait for Friday noon if they think waiting costs them everything. Fenwick hesitated, his mouth opening slightly, some further confession visibly gathering behind his teeth before he caught it and swallowed it back down. There's something else. Started, then stopped himself, for glancing again toward the window. No, it isn't my place. I've said more than I should have already, Mr. Fenwick, please. Miss Larkin. His voice had gone thin, pleading almost. I have a wife, a daughter in Copperline, who depends on what I send her every month. I've already risked more this morning than I have the courage to risk twice in one conversation. Bryn studied him a long moment, fear plain and human on his face, frowned, somewhat to her own surprise. She couldn't quite bring herself to push harder against a man who'd already given her more truth than his own safety could easily afford. All right, she said finally. You've told me enough. Fenwick's shoulders sagged, relief and shame tangled together in equal measure. I wish that were true. I wish I'd told you enough to actually help. Something cold settled into Bryn's chest, because that lined up. That lined up exactly with a stranger standing across the street, with a broadsheet and a wagon full of chains built for someone her size. There's a man in town, she said slowly. Calls himself Barker. Says he represents a travelling exhibition. Fenwick's face went pale, actually pale, the colour draining out of it like water from a cracked jug. I've heard the name. You've heard what he wants. I've heard rumours. Fenwick swallowed hard. That Voss made him an arrangement. That if the note isn't paid if you refuse to leave quietly, there's a second offer on the table, one that doesn't require your land at all. Just me. Fenwick didn't answer. He didn't need to. Bryn stood there a long moment, feeling something shift inside her chest. Something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite fury, but sat somewhere in the narrow space between the two, hot and quiet and building. I can't extend the note, Fenwick said, and his voice had gone thin with genuine shame now. Voss calls in every loan he holds against this bank. He shuts our doors. I have a family, Miss Larkin. I am truly deeply sorry. You keep apologizing, Bryn said quietly, like that's the same thing as helping. Fenwick flinched at that. Small visible thing, like she'd struck him somewhere soft. I wish I could offer you more than sorry, so do I. She was already turning toward the door. Wishing's free, Mr. Fenwick. It's the only thing in this bank that still is. Free turned and walked out before he could answer that, because there was nothing left to say that would change the arithmetic sitting on his desk. But she caught, just before the door swung shut behind her, the look on his face, not relief at being done with an uncomfortable conversation, but something rawer than that, something that looked for just a moment like a man watching his own cowardice from the outside and not much caring for the view. The street outside had gone strange and quiet in the way streets did right before something ugly happened in them. Barker was gone from his post across from the bank. That should have felt like relief, or it didn't. Because gone meant he'd stopped its watching and started moving. And a man like that didn't stop watching unless he already had what he needed. Bryn had made it 3 storefronts down. When Reeve Malone stepped out from the shade of the saloon awning, blocking her path with the particular swagger of a man who'd been waiting all morning for an excuse, Miss Larkin, he rolled the toothpick in his mouth to the other side. Heard the bank turned you down. News travels, especially bad news, he smiled. It didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. Mr. Voss figured you'd come around eventually. Man like him usually gets what he wants. Man like him is drowning in debt he can't pay, using a scared old bank manager and a hired showman to bail himself out. Bryn's voice stayed level, flat. Funny thing to build a reputation on. Malone's smile faltered. Just slightly, just enough. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about, Reeve. Bro, I know your boss is one bad month from losing everything he's got. I know he's so desperate, he's willing to sell a woman to a traveling circus to buy himself another season. She took a step forward. Just one. For it was enough to make Malone's hand twitch toward his gun belt out of pure instinct before he caught himself. And I know my father put that scar on your chin for stealing a horse that wasn't yours. So before you decide to test me on a street corner, you might ask yourself how that story ended for you the first time. That was a long time ago. Was it? Bryn's eyes didn't move from his face, because you still touch it when you're nervous. You did it twice just now. For Malone's hand jerked away from his own jaw like it had been burned. Just being neighbourly, he muttered finally, and stepped aside. Bryn walked past him, without another word. Her hands didn't shake until she was 3 blocks clear, and out of sight, and even then, only for a moment. She rode home under a sky bruising toward dusk, the weight of everything Fenwick had told her sitting heavier than the flour sack tied behind Duke's saddle. 2 days left. She fed Duke, cracked the water trough, dangerously low, same as it had been for a week now. Walked inside without lighting the lamp right away, because some nights the dark felt honest in a way the light didn't. She sat in her father's chair. Fro held the pocket watch Josiah had left, turning it slowly between 2 fingers that could have crushed it without meaning to measure what matters, not what's owed. I hope you made it somewhere safe, old man, she murmured into the dark. Because it's about to get ugly out here, and I don't think anyone's coming to fix it but me. She didn't sleep much that night either. Thursday morning arrived the colour of a fresh bruise, purple and grey along the eastern ridge, and Bryn was already saddled and moving before the sun had cleared it, because the herd needed selling, because selling meant getting them to the stockyard in Copperline, the next town over, before Friday noon closed every door in her face for good. And because the only road wide enough to drive a herd through ran straight along the base of Coldwater Canyon, which was as exactly where she found the rock slide. She heard it before she saw it Duke's ears pinning back, a low uneasy stamp of his hooves against the trail. Then she came around the bend and understood why. A slab of Red Canyon wall had come down sometime in the night. 4 boulders, the size of wagon beds, choked the narrow pass floor to ceiling, dust still hanging faint in the still morning air, like the mountain hadn't quite finished settling. There was no way around it, not without a 4-day detour through country too rough for cattle. Not with the clock she was working against. Bryn sat Duke for a long moment staring at it. Then she swung down, because sitting there, feeling sorry for herself, had never once moved a single stone in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. She started with the smaller rocks first. For ones a normal man might have needed a mule team and an hour to shift, she threw them clear with both hands, one after another, for a rhythm building in her shoulders like a drum beat. Sweat cut clean lines through the dust on her face. Her breath came hard, but it came steady. The boulders came next. She wedged her hands under the first one, planted her boots, and pulled. It didn't move at first, which only made her angrier, which only made her pull harder. Until something in the earth gave way with a groan that echoed off the canyon walls, and the stone rolled clear, crashing down the slope behind her in a cloud of dust and gravel. 1 boulder, then another, then a third that took both arms wrapped fully around it, and every ounce of strength in her back before it finally shifted loose. Her muscles screamed with every lift, her palms split raw against the rock. She thought, somewhere in the haze of it, her father hauling fence posts alongside her 2 years back, laughing at how thoroughly she'd outpulled him, for never once looking embarrassed by it, for only ever proud. For that memory carried her through the 4th boulder, for on the 5th her hands had split open somewhere around the 6th stone, though she only noticed once the sweat started stinging in the cuts, which didn't matter. Except it did matter, actually, because bleeding hands gripped rock worse than whole ones. Except stopping to wrap them cost minutes she didn't have, except, and here was the thought that kept circling back, no matter how many times she tried to shove it aside, except what if she cleared this whole canyon, and it still wasn't enough? Voss came anyway. What if none of this, for the blood, for the ache, for the whole desperate morning, actually changed a single thing about Friday noon? She made herself stop the spiral, Breathe out slow, squeeze the next boulder loose instead of squeezing her own thoughts into a knot. One stone, then the next, then the one after that. Some problems, her father used to say, you can't outthink, you can only outwork. It was fairly certain he hadn't meant it quite this literally when he'd said it. He decided, hauling the seventh boulder, clear, with a groan that came from somewhere low in her chest, that he'd probably forgive the interpretation anyway. For by the time the pass stood clear, Fran had climbed high and merciless overhead, and her whole body felt like it belonged to someone else, someone considerably more tired, considerably more human, than the version of herself that had ridden out at dawn. Certain, this single canyon was the only obstacle left standing between her and Friday noon. She hadn't yet learned, standing there catching her breath in the settlings dust, that the canyon had never been the real obstacle at all. That the real one was still coming, 12 men and a cage wagon strong, and no amount of cleared stone in the world was going to move it out of her path the same easy way. She did not know at first that she was being watched. For Walt Draper had been riding the high trail above the canyon since dawn, trekking on a stretch of Voss's fence line that bordered Larkin land. When he'd heard the first crash of stone echoing up out of the pass, he'd assumed trouble. Outlaws, maybe, or a wagon accident. For what he found instead when he reined up on the ridge overlook and looked down, stopped his horse cold beneath him, a single figure, alone. Working her way through a rock slide that should have required a full crew and half a day of dynamite, hauling stone after stone clear of the trail with her bare hands, for her whole body a study in a kind of strength, Draper had heard rumoured his whole life, and never once actually believed in until this exact moment. He sat there a long time, just watching. Because there was something in the sight of it that reached back 30 years into his own memory, back to a younger version of himself riding fence lines with a sheriff named Wade Larkin, for a man who used to say the measure of a person wasn't the size of what they could lift, it was what they carried, without setting it down in front of other people. Draper had believed that once. He'd stopped believing much of anything since he'd started drawing a wage from Garrison Voss. There had been a slow erosion to it, the way a man convinces himself one small compromise at a time that the work still means something even after the man paying for it stops deserving any loyalty at all. Draper had told himself 100 different versions of that lie over the last 2 years. Watching Bryn Larkin haul stone alone in that canyon, every one of those lies suddenly sounded exactly as thin as they'd always been. He watched Bryn clear the final boulder from the pass, watched her stand there afterward with her hands braced on her knees, breast heaving, alone in that canyon with no one to see the effort but him. Then he made a decision he'd been avoiding for a long time. He rode down. Bryn heard the horse before she turned, and her hand went instinctively to the rifle, strapped along Duke's saddle. Easy. Draper reined up a careful distance away, hands visible, palms open. I didn't come to cause trouble. You work for Voss. Bryn didn't lower her hand. Forgive me if that doesn't inspire much trust. I work for the man who signs my paycheck. Draper swung down, slow, deliberate, showing her every movement before he made it. Doesn't mean I like everything he tells me to do lately. Everyone who works for Voss says some version of that eventually. Bryn's voice stayed hard, usually right before they do exactly what he tells them anyway. Draper's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue the point. I rode with your father a handful of times. Years back, before Voss bought his way into this valley and started buying up everybody's silence along with it. My father arrested men who broke the law. He didn't make deals with them. No. Draper looked older suddenly, the lines on his weathered face carved deep by more than just sun. He didn't, and I've spent a long time wondering what he'd think of the man I turned into instead. Bryn said nothing. Watched him, the same sharp, careful reading her father had taught her, looking for the twitch, prowl, the thing that would give away whether this was a trick. She didn't find one. Just an old man carrying something heavy he'd finally decided to set down. I came to warn you, Draper said quietly. Voss isn't waiting for Friday noon. Bryn's stomach dropped. He's moving tomorrow morning. First light. He's bringing every hired gun on the payroll, and he's bringing Barker's wagon with him. Draper's voice had dropped to something almost gentle now, the gentleness of a man delivering news he wished he didn't have to. Not just an eviction anymore, Miss Larkin. He means to take the land and hand you over in the same morning. 2 problems solved with 1 ride. How many men? 10, maybe 12. Draper's eyes held hers, steady. Parker's got chains forged special, iron bands, thick as fence rail. A cage built into that wagon strong enough to hold a bull. I've seen it myself. Bryn felt something cold and sharp settle behind her ribs, because she'd known somewhere that it would come to this. Or known it since the moment she'd seen Barker's smile across the street. Hearing it confirmed out loud in broad daylight still landed like a physical blow. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Voss finds out, he'll fire you, might do worse." Draper reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a canvas-wrapped bundle, and held it out to her. Extra rounds for the rifle, more than she owned herself. "A man can only swallow so much poison before it makes him sick, Miss Larkin." He set the bundle in her outstretched palm small in her hand, though he didn't seem to notice the size difference, the way most men did, if he noticed, for he'd stopped caring somewhere in the last few minutes. "For I'm an old man. I don't have much time left to balance my own scales. This is me trying. Come with me then." The words were out before Bryn had fully decided to say them. "Stand with me tomorrow instead of against me." France. Crossed Draper's face regret, maybe, or the particular exhaustion of a man who wished he had a different kind of courage than the one he'd been given. "I can't." His voice was rough. "I've got a sister in Copperline depending on my wage. I can't lose this job and still send her what she needs." "I'm sorry, I know that's a coward's answer." "It's an honest one," Bryn said, quieter now. "That's worth something too." He mounted back up, slow the weight of the morning sitting visibly on his shoulders. He paused before riding off, looking back at her one more time. "Whatever you're planning to do tomorrow," he said, "do it smart. Barker doesn't want you dead. Voss doesn't care either way. 4. That's the difference that might save your life, if you're careful enough to use it. 4. Then he turned his horse and rode back up toward the ridge, leaving Bryn alone in the cleared canyon pass, with a bundle of rifle rounds in one hand and a countdown now measured in hours instead of days. She'd not pushed the cattle through to Copperline that day. 4. There wasn't time left to matter, not with an army arriving at first light, and there was no sense selling a herd to save a house that might not be standing come Friday afternoon regardless. Rode home instead. Slow, deliberate. 4. Memorizing the land. The way a person memorizes something they're afraid of losing the shape of the ridge against the sky. The particular gold, the light turned everything an hour before sunset. Crooked oak on the hill above her mother's grave that had refused to die for 20 years out of what Bryn had always privately believed was pure stubbornness inherited straight down the family line. She found Cyrus Pruitt waiting on her porch when she rode in, his old buckboard pulled up near the barn, a crate of provisions already unloaded and stacked neat by the door. "For wondered when you'd notice me sitting here," he said, climbing down off the porch step with the particular carefulness of a man well past the age when his knees agreed with sudden movements. "Almost gave up and let myself in. You drove all the way out here." Bryn swung down off Duke, exhaustion from the canyon still heavy in her shoulders. "For that's a long ride for a man who complains about his back every time he restocks the top shelf." "My back can complain all it likes. Doesn't mean I stop listening to the rest of me." Cyrus nodded toward the crate. "Flour, salt pork, for a little coffee, because Lord knows you'll need it before this is finished, and a box of shells I had sitting in the back room that nobody's bought in 2 years. Bryn looked at the crate a long moment before she trusted her own voice. "I can't pay you for this, Cyrus. Didn't ask you to." He said it simply, no performance in it, the same plain warmth he always carried. "Heard what's coming tomorrow. Whole town's heard it by now, one way or another. For most of them are too scared to do anything but whisper about it over their supper. And you're not. I'm old, Bryn. Scared stopped doing me much good a long time back." He glanced toward the western horizon, toward Coldwater Canyon, sitting dark and silent under the coming dusk. "Your daddy kept this whole valley honest for 20 years, mostly by being the one man too stubborn to look away when everybody else did. Figured it was past time. Somebody besides you remembered that." Something tightened hard in Bryn's throat. She busied her hands with the crate, instead of trying to speak past it right away, for hauling it up onto one shoulder like it weighed nothing at all, which to her very nearly didn't. "I mean it, Cyrus. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." He climbed back up onto the buckboard, settling the reins in his weathered hands. "Thank me Saturday, once you've still got a roof over your head to be grateful unto. And if I don't—" Cyrus's face went serious for the first time since he'd arrived, the easy warmth folding into something steadier. "For then this town buries another Larkin it should have done more to protect, and I spend the rest of my days regretting I didn't drive out here sooner and say all this louder." He tipped his hat, the gesture somehow both old-fashioned and entirely sincere. "But I don't believe that's how tomorrow goes, Bryn. I've watched you build half this valley back up with your own 2 hands. I don't figure Garrison Voss is the thing that finally stops you." He clicked the reins before she could answer that, the buckboard creaking off down the darkening road, leaving Bryn standing alone in her yard with a crate of provisions on her shoulder and something warm and unfamiliar sitting stubborn in her chest, right alongside the fear. She was starting to understand didn't have to travel alone. Not entirely, not anymore. At the ranch, she went through the motions of the evening mechanically, brushed Duke, checked the barn. Barred the heavy front door, reinforced his back with beams thick enough that an ordinary man would have needed a battering ram to test it. An ordinary man, that was the trouble. She wasn't facing ordinary men tomorrow. She was facing 10 of them, plus a showman with iron chains forged special for a woman built exactly her size, plus a debt-drowned cattle baron with nothing left to lose and every reason in the world to stop playing by any rule he'd ever claimed to follow. Lit the lamp on the table. Sat down, pulled her father's revolver from its holster and checked the cylinder. 6 rounds. She checked the rifle next, fully loaded plus Draper's extra rounds set beside it in a neat, careful row. It would not be enough. She knew that with the same clear, cold certainty she'd known most hard truths in her life. 10 men, maybe 12, against 1 woman. However large, or however strong, the math simply did not work in her favor. And pretending otherwise would only get her killed faster, which left her with exactly one decision to make: run or stand. She thought about the version of herself that ran, packed what she could carry, rode through the night, found some far corner of the territory where nobody had heard the stories yet, started over as someone smaller, quieter, safer. Except that version of her didn't feel like her at all. That version felt like a woman wearing Bryn Larkin's skin without any of what actually lived underneath it. She thought instead about her father, a year gone now, dying slow in that same bed where Josiah had slept only 2 nights before. She could still see the room exactly as it had been. That final week, the shutters cracked to let in air too hot to help, the basin of water gone lukewarm on the nightstand, her own enormous hands feeling, for the first time in her life, entirely useless against the one enemy strength alone could never move. She had tried, God help her, she had tried, had carried him to the doctor, in Copperline herself, cradled against her chest like something fragile enough to break with the wrong step, faster than any wagon could have managed it. The doctor had done what he could, for it hadn't been enough, for it was never going to be enough, and some stubborn, furious part of her had spent that whole ride blaming her own hands for not being able to fix what no hands, however large, were built to fix. For on the last night he'd asked her to help him sit up. She had, careful as her mother had ever taught her to be with anything fragile. And he'd looked around the small room like he was memorizing it, the badge on the mantel, the rifle over the door, the window facing east toward a sunrise he wouldn't see again. Clara, he'd started, for then caught himself and laughed, weak and rasping. "Forgive an old man. Wrong name in my head tonight. Your mother's sister back in Missouri. Never met you, but I always did think you'd have gotten on with her." Bryn had said nothing. Had only held his hand the way she'd once held her mother's, terrified in exactly the same old familiar way of breaking something too precious to survive her own grip. Rand isn't just dirt and rock, he'd told her, voice down to threads by then, barely more than breath shaped into words. "Our promise. For your mother and I made it out of nothing, out of wild grass and worse men, and we held it because the holding was the only thing that ever worked out here. We stood up to wolves, we stood up to outlaws. Don't you let the wolves start wearing fine suits someday and steal your courage right along with everything else, just because they've learned to smile while they do it." She'd promised him. Of course she'd promised him. For what else was there to say to a dying man except the thing he needed most to hear? "For you're a Larkin," he'd said, the last full sentence she ever heard him speak clearly. "You hold the line." He'd gone quiet before morning. She'd sat with him the whole night through, same as she'd sat with her mother years before, her enormous hands folded uselessly around his small, weathered ones, learning all over again the particular cruelty of being strong enough to move mountains and powerless against the one thing that actually mattered. If she was a Larkin, she would hold the line. For, even if the line was one woman against 12, standing on a porch her father had built with his own 2 hands, refusing to be smaller than the moment required. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the window in her father's chair, rifle across her knees, watching the moon travel slow across a sky that gave no answers and offered no comfort, for only the quiet, patient turning of hours toward morning. Friday arrived the color of a held breath. No wind, no bird song, the kind of stillness that sat over the desert, right before something violent tore through it. Bryn washed her face in the basin, braided her hair back tight and pinned it, out of the way of whatever the morning demanded of her. She pulled on her father's old leather vest, one built to her size, and pinned the silver star to the chest of it. As if today was the day she stood her ground, she intended to stand it wearing every piece of him she had left. She stepped out onto the porch as the first grey light broke over the eastern ridge. The rifle rested against the porch post within easy reach. Her father's revolver sat heavy on her hip. The pocket watch Josiah had left sat tucked deep in her vest pocket, close against her ribs, though she couldn't have said exactly why she'd wanted it there this morning of all mornings. She waited. At 8 o'clock, the wind picked up, carrying grit across the yard in thin, restless waves. At 9 she saw it, a thick column of dust rising on the eastern horizon, moving fast, moving wide. Not one rider, many. Bryn's heartbeat found a steady, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Something in her went very calm. Still, the way the desert itself sometimes went right before a storm broke not peace exactly, but a kind of clarity that made peace unnecessary. She picked up the rifle. The riders came into view first. 12 of them, hard-faced, rifles resting easy across their saddles, kicking up dust that drifted thick and gold in the early light. Garrison Voss rode at the front on his black stallion, a long grey duster snapping behind him in the wind. Reeve Malone rode close beside him, and even from this distance, Bryn could see the man's hand hovering near his gun belt, twitchy, eager. Behind them, lumbering slower over the uneven ground, came the wagon. It was built heavy, reinforced with iron banding along every seam, for a cage visible through the wooden slats on its bed, thick chains coiled inside it like something sleeping and patient. Elmore Barker rode alongside it on a pale grey horse, unhurried, dressed in that same too-fine coat, watching the ranch house with the calm, proprietary interest of a man arriving to collect something he already considered his. The whole procession halted at the edge of the yard. Horses stamped and snorted, drifted slow across the porch, catching gold in the early sun. Voss looked at Bryn standing alone on the porch, looked at the silver star pinned to her chest, looked at the rifle held steady in her hands. A cold, thin smile spread across his face. "Good morning, Miss Larkin." Voice carried easily across the yard, pitched loud, meant to be heard by every man behind him. "You'll notice we're early," I noticed. Bryn's voice came out clear. It carried just as far as his hat. Noon was the agreement. Agreements are for men who can still afford to keep them. Voss's smile widened, thin and ugly. "I find myself unable to wait that long." "Because you're drowning," Bryn said. "Because the Sonoran line collapsed under you 2 years back, and every acre you've bought since has just been you trying to bail water out of a ship that's already gone under." Something flickered hard and fast across Voss's face, surprise, then fury, replacing each other so quickly Bryn barely had time to register the first before the second arrived. "You've been listening to gossip," he snapped. "I've been listening to the truth, which is more than you've offered anybody in this valley in a long while." Bryn's grip tightened, steady on the rifle. "You don't want my land for grazing, Mr. Voss. You want it because it's the only thing left that might save you from your own mistakes. And when that wasn't enough, you decided to sell a human being to make up the difference." Voss's jaw clenched. He glanced sideways at Barker, and for just a moment something like shame crossed his features before he buried it under something colder. Business, he said, requires flexibility. Cruelty requires an excuse. Bryn shot back. You've just given yours. Barker chose that moment to speak for the first time, his voice smooth, unbothered by the tension, crackling through the yard like heat off a stove. Miss Larkin. He tipped his hat, an almost pleasant gesture entirely at odds with the cage rattling softly on the wagon behind him. I represent an exhibition that would treat you with every courtesy. Fair wages, a share of the door. You'd want for nothing. I'd want for everything, Bryn said. Just from behind bars instead of in front of them. Barker's smile didn't falter. That's one way to see it. It's the only way to see it. Voss's patience, thin to begin with, snapped entirely. Enough talk. He turned in his saddle, nodding sharply toward his men. Tear the fence down or burn the barn if she raises that rifle, and somebody get that cage open. The riders spurred forward. Malone drew his pistol with a sharp metallic clack that seemed to echo off every wall of the canyon behind the house. Bryn raised the rifle to her shoulder, sighting straight down the barrel at the center of Garrison Voss's chest. First man who crosses that fence post, she said. Walk away from it. The riders hesitated. They'd all heard the stories about her father, about her, about what happened to men who tested a Larkin and lost. Freeze one woman. Voss barked, face now, desperation showing plain beneath the fury. Ride forward. All of you now. Malone kicked his horse into motion first, raising his pistol. Bryn's finger found the trigger, and that was when the world tilted sideways. Because two of the riders of the western flank had already broken off from the group, circling wide, out of Bryn's direct line of sight, exactly the way trained men circle when they've done this kind of work before. Because she felt the impact, before she understood it, a heavy coil of rope, weighted at both ends, whipping around her legs from behind, and yanking hard enough to buckle her knee, sending her staggering sideways off the porch step, a shot going wide into the dust instead of into Voss's chest. Because Barker had never intended a fair fight, not once, not for a single second, and every calm word out of his mouth this whole morning had simply been the sound of a trap, being sprung slow enough that she wouldn't feel the teeth close until it was already too late. She hit the ground hard. The rifle knocked loose from her grip. 3 more ropes came at her, at once weighted, expertly thrown, for the kind of gear built specifically, deliberately, for bringing down something larger than any ordinary target these men had ever hunted before. She tore one rope clean in half with her bare hands. Sent one rider flying backward off his horse with a single furious swing of her arm, drove her shoulder into a second man, hard enough to crack a saddle horn clean off its leather. For one wild, for a blazing moment it looked like the sheer force of her might be enough to break free of all of it at once. For a handful of heartbeats it almost worked. Got one arm fully loose, swung it wide, caught a third rider across the chest and sent him tumbling off his mount into the dirt with a sound like a dropped sack of grain. She surged upright, half the rope still trailing from her other arm, close enough to the fallen rifle that hope glared bright and reckless in her chest. Then Barker's voice cut through the chaos, calm as ever, utterly unhurried. The legs, now 2 more ropes, weighted and precise, whipped low around her ankles at once. She went down hard a second time, the impact driving the breath clean out of her, and this time 3 men were on the ropes at her arms before she could gather herself to rise again. She could hear Voss shouting something over the chaos. She could hear Malone's boots hitting the dirt somewhere close, another loop of rope arcing through the air. Twisted, tore, kicked, refused with every last ounce of strength in her body to let this be the morning that ended the way they wanted it to end. A boot caught her hard across the shoulder, and she used the momentum of it, twisting into the blow instead of away from it, driving her elbow back into whoever had thrown it hard enough to hear him grunt and stagger. Another rope snapped taut against her wrist, strained against it, until the fibres groaned, until her muscles screamed with an effort that would have torn a normal man's arms clean from their sockets. Still it held, thick and stubborn and built for exactly this, except there were too many, except every rope she tore loose was replaced by 2 more. Her strength, however vast, was still one woman's strength, and 12 men working in practice coordination had numbers on their side that no single body, however large, fully overcome alone. She went down to one knee, breast heaving, for blood on her lip where she'd bitten it without noticing, ropes cinching tighter around her arms with every second that passed. Somewhere close she heard the heavy creak of the cage wagon's door swinging open, the rattle of chains being dragged free of their coil, understood, for, with a cold clarity that cut straight through the pain, exactly how close this morning had come to being the last one she spent as a free woman. And that was the moment pinned, furious, refusing even now to stop struggling, that Bryn heard it. A sound that had no business existing anywhere near this canyon, high, sharp, piercing straight through the chaos of the yard like a blade through cloth, steam whistle. Every man in that yard froze. Voss's head snapped toward the western ridge, confusion cutting hard through his fury. Malone's gun hand faltered mid-motion. Barker, for calm through every second of the morning until now, turned his head sharply toward the sound, with something that looked, for the very first time, like the beginnings of real concern. Because there were no train tracks anywhere near Redstone Flats, there had never been a single mile of rail laid in this entire stretch of territory. And yet the whistle came again, closer now, louder, unmistakable, rolling down off the western ridge on a rising column of dark smoke that had absolutely no business being there. Bryn, on her knees in the dirt, with ropes cutting into her arms and her rifle lying useless 6 feet away, lifted her head toward that sound with her chest heaving, and her vision blurred with pain and fury both, and somewhere underneath all of it, buried deep, single fragile thread of hope she hadn't let herself feel in days, because that whistle meant something was coming. She just didn't yet know what. The Giant of Redstone Flats, Part 3. The whistle came a third time. Closer now, loud enough to rattle glass in the windows of the ranch house. Voss's men had gone still, ropes still cinched tight around Bryn's arms, every one of them staring toward the western ridge like men watching a storm cloud they couldn't yet name. Then the ridge itself seemed to move. A heavy black shape crested the rise first, hissing steam into the pale morning sky, iron wheels crushing brush and stone alike beneath it, a traction engine Bryn had only ever seen sketched in a mail-order catalogue, and even then she hadn't quite believed the drawing was true to size. Behind it came riders, not 10, not 12, a dozen easily, moving in tight disciplined formation, dark uniforms catching the early light, rifles carried with the kind of practiced calm that came from men who did this work for a living and had never once needed to raise their voice to be obeyed. In front of that column rode a broad-shouldered man with a grey beard and a gold star pinned to his chest, bright enough to catch the sun from 50 yards out. And just behind him, in a polished black buggy that had absolutely no business surviving the rutted ranch road it had just come down, rode an old man in a charcoal suit, silver-headed cane resting across his knees, white hair combed neat despite the dust. Bryn's breath caught somewhere in her throat, because she knew that face. She'd nursed that face back from the edge of death 2 nights ago, or in her own bed, with her own hands, expecting nothing in return. Josiah Renwick, except he looked nothing like the man she'd found half dead in the desert. That man had been dust and sunburn and cracked lips, and sat straight-backed in a buggy that cost more than her entire herd, wearing an expression that had already decided, somewhere on the ride over, for exactly how this morning was going to end. Face had gone the colour of old ash. What, he said, no one in particular, is the meaning of this. Traction engine hissed to a halt at the edge of the yard, black smoke curling into the clean morning air. The uniformed riders spread out in a wide, silent line, forming a wall of rifles between Voss's men and the porch. Nobody on Voss's side moved to raise a weapon. Brave men facing one woman were one thing. Brave men facing 24 professionals with rifles already levelled were an entirely different arithmetic, and every single one of them did that math in the space of a heartbeat. Reeve Malone slid his half-drawn pistol quietly back into its holster. Marshall spurred his horse forward, gold star flashing. Garrison Voss. His voice carried the particular weight of a man who had said those words before, to men who'd learned to regret ever hearing them. Tell your men to drop their weapons now. Voss's mouth opened, closed, opened again. no sound coming out at all, the practiced smoothness that had carried him through a dozen small cruelties utterly abandoning him in the face of this one large consequence. Josiah Renwick stepped down from the buggy. He walked slowly, deliberately, past the marshal, past the line of rifles, straight toward the ropes, still coiled tight around Bryn's arms. Kneeling in the dirt where Voss's men had finally wisely stopped pulling. He knelt beside her, no small effort, age, in that fine suit, and with his own 2 hands, began working at the knots himself. Told you, tread quietly. For her, from storms you stand through. For others need a little help finishing. Bryn's throat had gone tight in a way that had nothing to do with the rope still crossing it. Supposed to be a lost cowboy. I was, Josiah said. Briefly. Turns out getting lost was the most useful thing I've done in a decade. Who are you? He glanced up at her, and for just a moment something almost sheepish crossed his weathered face. Chairman of the Cascade Overland Rail Company, as of this morning still holding that title, though it's been a rather eventful few days for the paperwork. He worked the last knot loose, and the rope fell away from her arms entirely. Came out here to walk the canyon route myself before I committed a fortune to it. My horse had other plans. So did the desert. You could have died out there. I very nearly did. Pale eyes held hers, steady or warm in a way that reminded her, briefly and painfully, of her own father. I'd have been forgotten within the week. A rich man's bones bleaching in the sun, and not a soul the wiser. Except you stopped, Miss Larkin. For you gave up your bed, your food, your time, when you had less of it to spare than almost anyone I've ever met. Bryn stood slowly, rope still trailing loose from one wrist, and looked past him at Voss, frozen on his horse, still watching this unfold, with the particular horror of a man watching his entire strategy collapse in real time. He was going to sell me, Bryn said, to a travelling's built special, a cage on a wagon. Josiah's jaw tightened. Something cold moved behind his eyes, the warmth from a moment ago gone entirely. I'm aware, he said. That detail arrived by telegraph 2 nights ago, and I confess it is the reason this morning's arrival came considerably faster than it otherwise might have. He turned toward Voss. Mr. Voss. Josiah's voice had changed entirely, now no longer the gentle warmth he'd offered Bryn, but something flat and precise, a man reading a verdict rather than delivering an opinion. I own the Redstone Trust Bank's principal creditor. As of yesterday evening, that debt belongs to me. Which means, as of yesterday evening, so does every ledger you have ever falsified through that institution. That's a lie. Voice cracked on the word, all his earlier smoothness gone. I am a respected businessman. You are a desperate one, Josiah said. Which is not the same thing, though I understand the confusion, since you've spent considerable effort dressing one up as the other. He pulled a thin stack of papers from his coat pocket, telegraph flimsies, their edges soft with handling. My auditors confirmed the rest of it overnight, forged collateral, falsified investor reports. Land titles claimed as leverage you never legally held. Josiah's voice did not rise, it didn't need to. And an arrangement with a travelling exhibition to purchase a human being outright in the event her land could not be seized through more conventional means. That last part, Mr. Voss, is the one the marshal here finds most personally interesting. For the marshal unrolled a heavy parchment, Garrison Voss. I hold a federal warrant for your arrest, charges of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy across territorial lines. His eyes flicked toward the wagon with its iron cage still rattling softly in the wind. I expect we'll be adding to that list before the day's out. Voss's eyes darted wildly across the yard to his men, to Malone, to the wall of rifles that hadn't wavered once through any of it. Shoot them, Voss snapped, his voice climbing towards something ragged and unrecognizable. I pay you to fight. Shoot them, all of you. Nobody moved. Because there is a particular moment in every desperate man's collapse where the people he's paid to follow him finally do the math themselves and find the answer doesn't favor loyalty anymore. For Malone unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall into the dust. For he did it slower than the others. For his eyes finding Bryn's for just a moment across the yard, something unreadable passing behind them, not quite apology, not quite shame, but somewhere in the direction of both. One by one, the rest followed, the soft heavy thuds of surrendered weapons, marking the exact moment Garrison Voss's small empire finished falling apart. Two of the uniformed riders dismounted, pulled Voss roughly from his stallion, and locked heavy cuffs around his wrists. He struggled, cursed. His fine grey suit gathered dust it had never once touched in 4 years of careful avoidance. Free look, Bryn thought, watching from the porch with rope still trailing from her wrist, for exactly like what he'd always been underneath the tailoring. A frightened man who'd run out of other people to blame. Marshal Aldous Kane, he said, by way of introduction, extending a broad, unweathered hand as though this were an ordinary morning and not the tail end of an armed standoff. Apologies for the delayed introduction seemed more pressing to disarm a dozen men first and make polite conversation second. I'd say you had your priorities straight, Marshal. Most days I try to. For Kane's eyes moved briefly to the wagon with its iron cage, something hardening in his weathered face. I've chased men like Barker before. Usually catch them after the fact, when there's nothing left to do but write down what happened to whoever they'd already taken. 4. This is the first time in longer than I care to admit that I've gotten to a wagon like that one, before it left with somebody inside it. Feels different, I imagine. Feels like the job's actually worth the saddle sores some mornings. 4. He gave her a nod that carried more weight than the gesture alone accounted for. For I mean what I said. Your father built a reputation in this territory that outlasted him by considerably more than a year. Standing here today, I'd say you're building one that'll outlast you by a good deal longer than that. Bryn didn't quite know what to do with a compliment that large, delivered that plainly, by a man who had every reason in the world to simply do his job and move along. She settled in the end for the truth. I didn't do it for a reputation, Marshal. Nobody worth remembering ever does, Kane said. That's usually how you can tell. He touched his hat again, turned back toward the business of loading prisoners. 4. And left her standing there with the words settling slow and warm somewhere behind her ribs, for alongside everything else the morning had already asked her to carry. For Elmore Barker did not struggle at all when they came for him. He simply sat his horse with the same calm, unbothered patience he'd worn across the street outside the bank 2 days earlier, 4, and allowed himself to be cuffed with the mild resignation of a man who'd always known, somewhere, that this particular gamble carried real odds of losing. No hard feelings, Miss Larkin, he said as they led him past the porch. It was purely business. It's never purely business, Bryn said when the merchandise can talk back. Before the wagon rolled out, Kane paused beside Barker long enough to look him over once, slow and assessing, the way a man might examine a debt he intended to collect on personally. For I had a cousin once, Prairie said, quiet enough that it seemed meant only for Barker, for though Bryn caught every word from where she stood. Different kind of unusual than Miss Larkin here. Man 'ta towns over offered my uncle good money for her, same as Voss offered you good money, for a poster and a promise. My uncle said yes. His jaw tightened, old grief surfacing plain beneath the professional calm. Me 11 years and considerably more of this badge than I ever wanted to use, tracking down what was left of the outfit that took her. I don't say that to make conversation, Mr. Barker. For I say it, so you understand exactly why I rode 24 men out here, at first light instead of waiting on the usual paperwork. Barker, for the first time all morning, did not offer a smooth reply. He simply looked at the marshal, something flickering behind his eyes that might, in a better man, have been the beginnings of shame. I didn't ask what happened to her, Bryn said quietly, once the wagon had started rolling toward town. No, Kane agreed. But I figured you'd understand better than most people why I wasn't in a mood to wait for noon. The marshal touched the brim of his hat toward her as the prisoners were loaded into the very wagon. Barker had brought to carry her away in a detail Bryn found she did not mind at all. Or we'll take it from here, Miss Larkin. His eyes were kind, weathered, the eyes of a man who'd seen enough of this territory's cruelty to recognize its opposite when it stood in front of him. Your father would be proud of how you held this line today. Bryn's eyes burned, sudden and unexpected. She swallowed hard against it. Thank you, Marshal. The lawman loaded the prisoners, gathered the surrendered weapons, ordered the remaining hired men to walk back toward Redstone Flats on foot, their horses confiscated as evidence, their bravado gone entirely somewhere along the ride out. The dust began to settle. The terrible morning had passed. For it was into that settling quiet that a lone rider came down off the northern trail at a hard gallop, dust flying up behind him, pulling his horse up short at the edge of the yard with a look on his face like a man who'd been running from his own conscience the whole way there. Walt Draper swung down before his horse had fully stopped moving. Miss Larkin. His voice came out rough, breathless. Cries swept the yard, the marshal's men, wagon, Voss in cuffs before landing on her, on the rope burns still visible across her wrists, and something in his face cracked open with an emotion he didn't try very hard to hide. For I heard the shots, I heard the whistle, he stopped, started again. I told myself I couldn't come. For I told myself my sister needed the wage more than you needed one more gun. I've been sick over it since sunup. You're here now, Bryn said. I'm here late. Draper's jaw worked. That's not the same thing, and you know it. 4. You said that yourself 2 days ago about a bank manager who kept apologizing instead of helping. Bryn studied him a long moment. There was something almost unbearable in watching a grown man hold his own failure up to the light like that, refusing to look away from it. You gave me the only warning I had, she said finally. Everything that happened after happened because I chose to stand here anyway. That's not a debt you owe me, Walt. That's just how it went. I'd still like to make it right, Draper said. If there's a way. Josiah, who had been listening from a few feet away with the quiet attentiveness of a man who never missed anything worth hearing, cleared his throat. There may well be, he said. A canyon grade doesn't build itself. Draper, and I understand from Miss Larkin that you know this land, for its people, far considerably better than any surveyor I could import from back east. 4. If you're looking to balance a scale, there are worse ways to spend the next several years than helping build something honest in a valley you already know how to read. Draper looked between them, something loosening in his shoulders that had likely been wound tight for longer than just this last week. For I'd be obliged, he said quietly. More than I know how to say properly. Then don't say it properly, Bryn told him, and something almost like a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Just show up on time tomorrow. That'll say it fine enough. Josiah climbed the porch steps slowly afterward, leaning on his cane, stood beside Bryn, looking out over the yard-churned earth, broken fence rail, for a rope still coiled loose and forgotten near the steps. You did not have to do any of this, Bryn said quietly. You owed me nothing, Mr. Renwick. I owed you everything. He looked at her, and there was no performance in it now, none of the careful business precision from a moment ago. Just an old man being entirely honest. When you found me in that desert, I wasn't a wealthy man. I wasn't a powerful one either. I was just an old fool who'd made a foolish mistake, crying slowly under a sun that didn't care one bit who I used to be back east. Anyone would have stopped. Josiah said gently, but with absolute certainty. For anyone would not have crossed this territory a dozen times in my life. Larkin, and I promise you, for not everyone stops. For most people calculate. They weigh the cost of helping against the cost of walking past, and more often than this country deserves, walking past wins. He shook his head slowly. You didn't calculate anything. You just knelt down in the dirt and gave a stranger water. He reached into his coat and produced a thick, sealed envelope, holding it out to her. Bryn took it carefully, opened it, and found the original deed to her ranch inside, crammed in heavy red ink across the front. Paid in full. Your debt is forgiven, Josiah said. Every dollar of it and every dollar Voss ever claimed you owed on top of it, I should mention, turns out to have been considerably inflated from the true balance. Once my accountants got a proper look at his books. Bryn stared at the paper in her hands, her vision blurred, hot and sudden. I don't know what to say. Say yes to the next part, Josiah said, before you thank me for the first. She looked up. What next part? The Cascade Overland Line needs a clean grade through Coldwater Canyon, Josiah said. For the route your father's own land happens to sit directly across. I do not intend to buy that land from you, Miss Larkin. I intend to lease it, handsomely, monthly. For as long as the rail operates through this valley, which, if my engineers are correct, will be a very long time indeed. For you could have just said that from the start, Bryn said, instead of nearly dying in my bed first. Something like a real laugh escaped him, dry and warm. For I could have, though I confess the dying nearly first version taught me considerably more about you than a business meeting ever would have. Bryn shook her head slowly, the weight of the last 5 days finally starting to loosen its grip somewhere behind her ribs. More, isn't there? I can see it on your face. Josiah's expression sobered. There is, and this part, I'll admit, isn't charity. It's need. He gestured back toward the canyon, toward the rock slide she'd cleared alone yesterday, with nothing but her own 2 hands, and a stubbornness that apparently ran clean through her whole bloodline. For word travels fast among railroad men, Miss Larkin, and word of what you did in that canyon yesterday travels faster than most. My engineers have spent 6 months trying to work out how to move stone through that pass, without dynamite risking the whole grade above it. You did in an afternoon what they couldn't solve on paper in half a year. You want to hire me. I want to make you foreman of the canyon crew, Josiah said. Fair wage, full authority over the work. The kind of position most men spend 20 years earning, which you have already earned in considerably less time, through no fault or virtue of mine. Bryn stood there a long moment, a deed in one hand, for the offer hanging in the air between them, felt something shift deep inside her chest that had nothing to do with relief over the ranch, or the debt, or even the danger that had finally passed. For, because her whole life her size had been the thing people flinched from, whispered about, tried to put behind rope and sell tickets to gawk at. For, and now an old man she'd pulled half dead out of the desert was standing on her porch, offering her the very same strength as the answer to a problem nobody else in this territory could solve. Say yes, Miss Larkin, Josiah said gently. For, and then perhaps you might make me a cup of that terrible chicory coffee I remember from 2 nights ago. Bryn laughed a real laugh, sudden and surprised out of her, the first one in longer than she cared to count, for I think I can manage that, Mr. Renwick. He left 3 days later, once the paperwork with the marshal's office had been settled, and the first survey crew from Cascade Overland had arrived to begin mapping the grade in earnest. Bryn rode with him, partway to the Copperline stage line, Duke keeping an easy pace alongside the buggy horse, the desert morning still cool enough to be comfortable. You're right, Josiah said. Not quite a question. Once the crew's underway, I'll want to know how the work is progressing, and I confess I've grown rather fond of your particular way of describing a problem. I'm not much of a letter writer, neither was I at your age. It's a skill acquired mostly out of necessity, same as most useful things. He glanced sideways at her, something searching in the look. May I ask you something, Miss Larkin? Before I go, you can ask. That night I woke in your bed, half out of my mind with fever. You told me most people lie to you about 3 things: your size, your strength, and whether they're truly comfortable in your company. His pale eyes held hers, steady and unhurried, the same careful attention he'd given her from the very first conversation. I've thought about that more than you might expect these last months. I find myself wondering which of those 3 you believe I've lied to you about. Bryn considered the question longer than she'd expected to need. None of them, I don't think, which is rarer than you'd guess. Good. Something eased in his weathered face, some worry she hadn't fully registered him carrying until it lifted. I'd hoped that was true. I find I'd rather be remembered as an honest man than a generous one, if I only get to keep one reputation. You can be both, I've seen you manage it. High praise, from a woman who doesn't hand it out freely. He reined the buggy horse to a gentle stop at the fork, where the Copperline road split off from her own, and looked at her a long moment, the particular look of a man committing something to memory on purpose. For what it's worth, Miss Larkin and I recognize the currency's changed considerably since the last time I said this to you. I don't believe I've ever met anyone, in a rather long and complicated life, who taught me quite so much about the actual weight of a kindness. Not the sentiment of it, the weight. You nearly died. I gave you water and a bed. It wasn't so complicated. It was the least complicated thing that's happened to me in 20 years, precisely why it mattered so much. She extended a hand. She shook it, careful as always, though the old careful had softened somewhere over these last months into something closer to habit than fear. Take care of my canyon, Miss Larkin. Take care of yourself, old man. Try not to collapse in any more deserts on my account. I make no promises. You've rather ruined me for ordinary business meetings. A dry, genuine smile. Turns out the interesting ones all seem to start with somebody nearly dying first. She watched the buggy roll off toward Copperline until it was nothing but a small dark shape against the pale horizon, for then turned Duke back toward home, toward the canyon, toward a life that had somehow, in the space of one impossible week, stopped feeling like something she merely survived and started feeling like something she was. Actually, finally, for a building, a month later, the valley around Redstone Flats had transformed into something Bryn barely recognized some mornings, standing on her own porch with coffee in hand, watching the sun come up over land that finally fully belonged to her. The old sagging fence line was gone, replaced by fresh timber running clean and straight across the property. The barn wore a new coat of red paint. In the near pasture, a herd twice the size of her old one grazed easy in the morning light, for paid for honestly, built up slow, exactly the way her father would have wanted it done. Down by the canyon mouth, where a rock slide had once nearly cost her everything, proper depot now stood brick and timber for a wide platform, steam engines rolling through twice daily now, carrying freight and mail and new faces into a territory that had spent too long being afraid of change. Bryn had overseen every foot of that grade herself, her crew 30 men strong now, for none of whom so much as blinked any more at the sight of their foreman lifting timber that would have required 4 of them working together had cleared Coldwater Canyon in a third of the time Josiah's original engineers had projected. 4. Walt Draper worked the crew alongside her most mornings, older than most of the hands, but sharper than half of them, the kind of foreman's shadow who caught mistakes before they became accidents. He'd taken to calling her boss within the first month, France, and something about the word, for coming from a man who'd once ridden for Garrison Voss, Gretel'd a small, old ache in Bryn she hadn't fully known was still there. Redstone Trust Bank had changed too, though more quietly than the rest of the valley. For Josiah had kept Otis Fenwick on as manager once the ownership passed into honest hands, on the condition delivered gently, but delivered plainly, that the bank would never again be used as a weapon against the very people it was meant to serve. For Bryn had stopped in one afternoon, that spring, to settle an account for feed and lumber, and found Fenwick's collar sitting looser than she'd ever seen it, his hands steady on the ledger instead of straightening papers that didn't need straightening. For I never got to say it properly, he'd told her, glancing up from the desk. That day you walked out of here. I've thought about it more than I care to admit. You don't owe me an apology, Mr. Fenwick. I owe you one anyway. His voice had been quiet, but there hadn't been any of the old nervous flutter in it. A man finds out eventually what kind of banker he wants to be. I'd like to think I'm finally getting the chance to be the right kind. Agree it, Bryn had said simply, and meant it, and left him to the work of becoming it. That flat itself had changed too, with Voss gone tried, convicted, shipped off to a federal penitentiary that would keep him considerably longer than 4 days. The fear that had gripped this town for years had finally started to loosen its hold. Businesses were thriving. Prairie had needed to hire a second clerk just to keep up with the mercantile's new traffic. People smiled when Bryn rode Duke down Main Street these days, waved, called her name. Nobody whispered about the giant of Redstone Flats anymore. They just called her Bryn, for the depot held its grand opening on the first truly warm Saturday of that spring, and it seemed like half the valley turned out to see it, women in their good dresses, from men who hadn't spoken 2 civil words to each other in years, standing shoulder to shoulder to watch the first scheduled passenger engine roll in beneath a banner reading Redstone Flats, hand-painted by Cyrus Pruitt's own steady grip. Bryn stood near the platform's edge in a clean shirt, and her father's vest, silver star catching the noon sun, feeling strange and exposed in a way that had nothing to do with her size and everything to do with simply being celebrated instead of stared at. You look like a woman who doesn't know what to do with a compliment, Walt Draper said, coming to stand beside her, close enough to be heard over the crowd's noise, but no closer than that. For I don't get many. Practice is thin. Get used to it. He nodded out at the gathered townsfolk, at the banner, at the whole bright noisy scene of it. This is your doing as much as Renwick's money. More, if you've asked half the men on that crew. Bryn watched the engine ease to a stop, stream hissing white against the blue sky, and let herself feel, for a moment, something like pride, instead of the old familiar bracing for judgment. For can I ask you something, Walt? Ask? Why'd you ever go to work for a man like Voss in the first place? For it doesn't seem like it ever sat right with you. Not even at the start. Draper was quiet a moment, his eyes on the crowd rather than on her. The particular quiet of a man deciding how much of an old wound he was willing to show daylight. My sister took sick a few years back. Consumption. Doctors in Copperline wanted money I didn't have and couldn't raise fast enough working an honest wage. He said it plainly, no self-pity in it, fact laid flat, the way facts usually came out of him. Voss offered triple what any other outfit in the territory was paying a foreman. I told myself I'd take the money, get her well, and walk away clean the first chance I got, and the chance never came. Chance never comes, Miss Larkin. That's the trick of men like Voss. They pay you just enough to need the money, and take just enough of your conscience along the way that leaving starts to feel more dangerous than staying. His jaw tightened. I watched him ruin 3 families before yours, told myself each time it wasn't my doing, since I wasn't the one signing the foreclosure papers, just the one holding the horse while somebody else did the signing. That why you finally rode out to warn me. Why I finally rode out to warn you. He met her eyes then, steady, unflinching. For watching you clear that rock slide alone, with your own 2 hands, for no complaint in you. Anywhere I looked at that and thought about every family I'd stood by and watched Vosper's brand, I decided I'd rather lose the wage than lose whatever was left of the man my own father raised me to be. Your sister. Or is she well enough now, married, settled in Copperline, doesn't need my wage near as much as she used to. Something almost like a smile crossed his weathered face. 4. Which is a roundabout way of saying I've got no excuse left for the next time I see something wrong and think about looking away. Figured I'd tell you that plainly so you can hold me to it should the need ever come again. True, Prynne said, and meant it. 4. And something passed between them that felt less like employer and foreman and more like 2 people who'd each, in their own way, chosen the harder, for better version of themselves when it mattered. Crowitz found them a few minutes later, weaving through the crowd with the particular energy of a man who'd sold more goods that morning than in the previous month combined. Bryn, come see. Fenwick's got something to show you over by the ticket window. She found Otis Fenwick standing proud beside a small brass plaque newly mounted on the depot's ticket office wall, for his collar looser than she'd ever seen it, genuine, for unguarded smile on his face, for what might have been the first time in the whole of their acquaintance. Redstone Trust Bank proud partner of the Cascade Overland Rail Company, honest dealing since 1883. Josiah's idea, Fenwick admitted, a little sheepish. Fred, a bank ought to advertise the thing it's actually proud of, instead of just the interest rates. It suits you, Bryn said. The honest part, I mean, not just the plaque. Fenwick's smile wavered, then steadied, something old and heavy visibly lifting off him. For I keep waiting for someone to tell me I don't deserve the fresh start. Nobody has yet. Maybe stop waiting for it then. Maybe I will. He glanced past her, toward the crowd, toward the whole transformed valley spread out beneath a depot that hadn't existed a year before. It's a fine thing you've built here, Miss Larkin. All of it. 4. Even the parts of it I didn't have the courage to help build until you'd already done the hardest work yourself. France, somewhere behind them, the engine let out a long, triumphant whistle. The crowd cheered, and people ran laughing along the platform edge for a golden afternoon. Redstone Flats looked exactly like the kind of town. Wade and Ruth Larkin had once ridden into this valley hoping, against all odds, to build. Around them, the valley kept celebrating Cyrus already deep in conversation with a new supplier off the afternoon train. Fenwick, laughing at something, Draper said, the whole unlikely assembly of people who'd each, in their own way, chosen to stand a little straighter than fear demanded of them. Bryn watched it all from the platform's edge and thought, not for the first time that year, that a home wasn't only the land a person defended. Sometimes it was simply the people who showed up afterward and stayed. From evenings, once the crew had gone home and the ranch had settled into its familiar dusk quiet, Bryn still walked out to the north pasture with her father's rifle, same as she had for years before. and worked through the old drills he'd taught her, one patient repetition at a time. Draw, sight, breathe out slow, squeeze. She didn't need the practice anymore, not really. Her aim had never wavered, not once, not even on the morning it had mattered most. 4. But there was something steadying in the ritual itself, something that had nothing to do with accuracy, and everything to do with keeping a promise to a man who'd never once treated her size as a burden to manage instead of a gift to master. For you've got a gift most folks would kill for, he used to say. He thought, some evenings, that he'd been wrong about only one small piece of it. It wasn't the strength itself folks had ever wanted to kill for. It was the ownership of it, the right to decide for herself what that strength was worth and who it belonged to. She'd spent a year fighting to keep that right. A whole hard, impossible week, fighting hardest of all. 4. And standing now in the cooling evening light, rifle steady in hands that had once nearly been offered up for $50 to a stranger with a wagon full of tonics, she understood, finally and completely, she'd won considerably more than a ranch. She'd won the plain, simple right to be exactly what she was, in a valley, finally willing to see it as worth something. She was tying Duke outside the mercantile one warm spring morning, for collecting the week's mail, when she noticed a man working in the shade outside the livery stable across the street, shoveling manure into a cart, shoulders hunched low, clothes worn thin at the elbows. Reeve Malone. When Voss's operation had collapsed, his hired men had scattered fast, most of them drifting toward trouble in other towns. Chasing whatever came next, Malone had stayed. For there wasn't much left for a man with his reputation chase elsewhere, and word around town said he'd been reduced to the lowest, most thankless work in Redstone Flats just to afford a hot meal most nights. Bryn watched him for a long moment, remembered the mocking smile on his face outside the saloon that day, remembered the pistol he'd drawn against her on the porch, the ropes his hands had helped throw. Perhaps she remembered, too, the look on his face when he'd unbuckled that gun belt and let it fall slower than the rest, surprise finding hers, something in them that hadn't looked like a man protecting himself. Or it had looked, if she was honest, like a man finally choosing which side of a line he actually wanted to stand on. Her father had taught her justice. Something else, someone else. For an old man who'd nearly died in her bed and come back to save her life instead had reminded her, or more recently, for about the second half of the lesson. Art justice alone, never quite finished on its own. She crossed the street. Malone froze the moment he saw her coming, flinching slightly, like a man bracing for a blow he half believed he'd earned. Miss Larkin. His voice came out rough, ashamed. He couldn't quite meet her eyes. Bryn reached her vest pocket and pulled out a folded paper, holding it out to him. "What's this?" he asked warily. "Your name's on the crew roster," Bryn said. "Coldwater grade." Foreman's short 2 hands for the summer push, and I'd rather fill the roles with men willing to earn an honest wage than watch this town keep throwing good men away because nobody bothered offering them a second chance. Malone stared at the paper like it might bite him. "For, after everything I did, you held ropes for a man who was drowning and desperate enough to sell a human being for profit," Bryn said, steady. Softness in it, and no cruelty either. Plain fact laid out flat between them. Truth, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. "But you also let go of that gun belt the second the odds turned honest, instead of dying stupid for a man who never once would have done the same for you. That tells me something too." Malone's jaw worked, throat tight. He took the paper with hands that weren't entirely steady. "Everyone deserves a second chance," Bryn said quietly. "I had mine, not so long ago. Seemed wrong to keep it only for myself." She turned and walked back across the street toward Duke, boots steady on the packed dirt, the morning sun warm across her shoulders. Round her, he heard Malone's breath catch, rough and unsteady, round of a man who hadn't expected kindness and didn't quite know yet what to do with the shape of it. That evening, Bryn rode the ridge above the ranch, as the sky went gold and violet over the canyon, the way it always did this time of year, the way it probably had every evening of her whole life, whether or not she'd stopped to notice it. For all her, the depot lights had come on, small and steady against the deepening dusk. Somewhere down there, freight engine let out one long, low whistle, rolling off the canyon walls, froze, and Bryn found herself smiling at the sound instead of bracing against it, the way she once might have. For because that whistle had once meant danger, arriving fast and unannounced, now it just meant home, arriving on time, same as always, exactly the way a person could count on. Prairie thought about her father's voice, worn thin near the end, telling her this land wasn't just dirt and rock. She thought about her mother's grave up on the hill, and the crooked oak that had refused, out of pure stubbornness, to ever stop growing. She thought about Walt Draper showing up late, but showing up all the same, and about Otis Fenwick, finally getting the chance to be the kind of man he'd always wished he'd been braver about being from the start. She thought about Reeve Malone, before walking off toward the livery that afternoon, with a folded paper in his hand and something new, something almost like hope, sitting uncertain in his shoulders. She thought about an old man dying of thirst in the desert, who'd turned out to be the very thing that saved her life in return. The desert had taught her, over one impossible week, that a person's size was never really the measure of anything that mattered. Not strength, not worth, not the shape of a life well lived. What mattered was what a person did with what they'd been given, and whether they were willing to kneel down in the dirt for a stranger who had nothing left to offer in return. Bryn Larkin had held the line. She had protected everything her parents built. And in the process, in the very trait that had once made her an outsider in her own hometown, she had found something nobody could have promised her at the start of that long, terrible week. She had found the exact place she belonged.